How did people in the Wild West survive the cold winters? You definitely didn't know about these methods. The romantic image of a frontier cabin is almost always the same. Massive logs, a cheerful fire in the fireplace, and a family gathered in cozy warmth. But this picture, created by books and movies, hides a harsh and cold truth. For the settlers of the Wild West, every winter night was not a time of rest, but a real battle for survival, where the main enemy was the frost that penetrated every crack. Their homes were not fortresses of comfort, but icy traps, and sleep was not rest, but a strategic operation to preserve precious warmth. Every detail of daily life, from the filling of the mattress to the arrangement of the sleepers, was subordinated to a single goal: to live to see the dawn. This is a story about survival technologies born out of a desperate struggle against the cold. Watch the video to the end to find out how a single mistake in preparing a bed could cost a settler their health, and why the warmest corner of the house was also the most dangerous. What if I told you the shocking truth that absolutely everything you romantically believed about the comfortable life in cozy log cabins of the pioneers is a complete lie and an illusion? The open hearth or stone fireplace, which we naively considered to be the warm heart of the home and a source of comfort, was in fact an extremely inefficient and wasteful source of heat for heating. Its main practical function was to cook hot food and light up a dark room, but it was by no means capable of fully heating the entire dwelling in winter. It was an illusion of warmth, not reality. The fireplace warmed the eyes with the sight of fire more than it warmed the body with heat. The vast majority of the hot air from the flames, up to 90% of the heat generated, was uselessly escaping directly into the wide chimney, irretrievably carrying precious heat into the atmosphere for nothing. In place of this hot air, compensating flows of icy air from the street were powerfully sucked into the room through numerous cracks in the log walls and windows, according to the laws of physics. A paradoxical, counterintuitive reverse draft effect occurred. The stronger and hotter the fire burned in the fireplace, the stronger and colder the chilling drafts across the floor became. The fire created cold instead of heat, a cruel irony of nature. As a result of this imbalance, it was difficult to warm only the front of the body facing the flames, while the back and the back of the head literally froze from the icy draft behind. The settlers bitterly described the agonizing sensation of being roasted in front and frozen in back at the same time. An unbearable contrast in temperatures. This forced them to constantly turn their entire bodies slowly toward the fire, like meat on a spit, in order to distribute the heat evenly over their entire bodies. There was no comfort, only a choice between heat and cold. In addition, the open, voracious hearth required an enormous, colossal amount of fuel to maintain the flame. Maintaining a stable fire throughout the long winter night, lasting 12-14 hours, was hard physical labor that required constant vigilance and the addition of firewood. Preparing enough firewood for the winter was one of the main and most exhausting, labor-intensive tasks for any family on the frontier. Tons of wood were used up during the season. Chopping, sawing, splitting, and storing firewood took months of work for the whole family. The acrid smoke from the damp wood, which did not completely escape through the poorly functioning chimney, thickly filled the only cramped room with suffocating smog and soot. This inevitably led to constant chronic problems with sore eyes and difficulty breathing for all the inhabitants. Life in such a smoke-filled house was a constant, exhausting struggle against the piercing cold, icy drafts, and suffocating smoke. The threefold enemy of health. There was no choice. One had to endure all three evils or freeze to death. The hot sparks and embers flying out of the open fireplace also posed a serious fire hazard. In a completely wooden, dry house, where the floor was often covered with dry straw or hay for insulation, a single accidental spark could easily lead to a catastrophic fire and the death of the entire family. At night, the family had to either risk their lives by leaving the dangerous fire smoldering unattended, or extinguish it and wake up in the morning in a completely frozen, icy room with frost inside. The choice was between the danger of burning alive or freezing to death. Both options were bad. The heat from the fire physically spread in a radiant manner over a very small, limited distance from the source. Just a few meters away from the burning fireplace, the temperature in the hut was not much different from the sub-zero temperature outside the wall. In fact, the zone of relative comfort and warmth was a tiny square meter patch in the huge icy space of the room. The rest of the house was almost as cold as the street. The fireplace did not heat it, but only created the illusion of warmth at arm's length. Therefore, the whole family was forced to gather as closely as possible to the fire within a radius of a meter, but this uncomfortable place was only suitable for daytime wakefulness and work, not for nighttime sleep because of the smoke and sparks. At night, when the fire died down, a completely different, desperate battle to preserve body heat began, and the cooling hearth played far from the main role of a source of heating. It was only a psychological illusion of warmth and safety in the endless ocean of freezing cold surrounding them on all sides. Experienced inhabitants of the hut knew from bitter experience that what could truly save them from freezing was not a weak fire in the fireplace, but the correct, well-thought-out organization of the interior space and the rational use of every available resource for insulation. Their sleeping area was not just a room with a bed, but a complex, multi-layered engineering system for preserving heat. Its main central element and savior was a properly arranged bed with many layers, not the fire in the fireplace, which only gave the illusion of protection. Do you honestly think that modern people, spoiled by comfort, could cope with such harsh living conditions for even one cold night without heating? Share your honest opinion in the comments below. Are you ready to learn the shocking truth about why log cabins, which we romantically consider a symbol of comfort and warmth, were actually deadly ice traps? Log cabins were built quickly and from locally available forest materials, but their primitive construction was far from perfect in terms of thermal insulation. The main critical problem was the countless gaps between the elements, through which the cold, piercing wind from the street penetrated unhindered. The hut was more like a wooden tent than a real house from a modern point of view of insulation. The space between the horizontal logs, called chinking in English, was filled with an improvised mixture of clay, moss, dry grass, or simply mud and straw. This fragile material quickly cracked from temperature changes and frost and gradually fell out from strong winds and vibrations. As a result, after a few months, the walls of the hut resembled a leaky sieve or colander rather than reliable, impervious protection from the elements and cold. Each crack was a channel for cold air to penetrate, and there were hundreds of them around the perimeter of the house. Such temporary structures often did not have a solid foundation by definition. The hut was built directly on level ground or on simple stones, and the cold from the frozen ground penetrated unhindered from below into the living space. The floors were either simply trampled earth without any covering or made of roughly hewn boards, which also had large gaps between them, measuring several centimeters. The cold rose from the floor like ice, making life below unbearable. Feet were always cold. Windows, if they were even provided in the walls, were simple rectangular openings in the wall without frames. At best, they were covered with oiled paper or thick fabric for light, which provided virtually no protection from the penetrating cold and wind. Real glass windows and frames were extremely rare and an unaffordable luxury available only to the wealthy. Most people spent the winter without windows at all, in complete darkness, boarding up the openings with planks. The door was another constant source of painful drafts day and night. It was crudely made from unfinished boards and rarely fit tightly enough against the wooden frame due to the curvature of the wood. Huge gaps of several centimeters formed around the entire perimeter of the door, through which frosty air from the street constantly whistled. The door was more a symbol of a boundary than a real barrier to the cold. The roof was often covered with turf and soil or tree bark due to the lack of other materials. Such a primitive roof regularly leaked dirty water during thaws and did not retain precious heat inside very well. Snow, which accumulated in a thick layer on the roof, provided additional natural insulation in winter, but created a serious risk of the structure collapsing under its weight. The roof was the weakest element of the structure, requiring constant attention and repair. The exhausted inhabitants had to constantly fight an endless battle with the gaps in their repair. They methodically plugged them with old worn-out rags, moss from the swamps, absolutely anything that came to hand and could serve as insulation. But it was a never-ending task, as new gaps constantly appeared as the wood settled and dried out. Caulking was not a one-time action during construction, but a constant maintenance process throughout the winter. The design of the house was strictly dictated not by the comfort of the inhabitants, but by the speed of construction before the frosts and the availability of materials in the area. The main priority for the settlers was to get at least some kind of roof over their heads before the inevitable onset of the deadly winter. High-quality insulation and airtightness were the last things on their minds. If they thought about them at all, there was no choice. Survival was more important than comfort. A roof was more important than warmth. That was the priority in construction. As a result of these numerous shortcomings in winter, the temperature inside the hut was only a few miserable degrees higher than the outside temperature, even with a burning hearth. But how exactly did people physically sleep and survive in these freezing structures without heating? In the next exciting chapter, I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of survival in an icy bed, which had absolutely nothing to do with the number of blankets or their quality. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of frontier survival, which has been carefully passed down from generation to generation like a treasure. The main weapon in the daily struggle against the deadly nighttime cold was not the stove with its weak fire, nor the number of blankets, but the well-thought-out organization of the family's collective sleep. The concept of a big bed, or several people sleeping together, was not a sign of poverty or backwardness, but a conscious, well-thought-out survival strategy based on the physics of heat exchange. It was not a lack of money for separate beds, but a rational solution to the problem of cold by combining heat resources. The entire extended family of several generations slept together tightly on one large shared bed without separation. This critically allowed for the most efficient use of the most valuable and free source of heat, the warmth of living human bodies with a temperature of 36.6 Celsius. In the cramped space, each sleeper warmed their neighbor with their breath and body heat, creating a common warm microclimate under multi-layered blankets that would have been impossible to achieve alone. The group of bodies worked like a biological furnace, where each organism was both fuel and a source of heat. There was a strict, unshakable hierarchy of body placement on the bed based on vulnerability. The youngest children and most vulnerable family members, infants, the sick, the elderly, were strategically placed in the center of the bed, in the warmest and safest place, protected on all sides. Healthy adult men and women lay down at the edges of the bed, consciously taking the brunt of the penetrating cold and drafts. It was a sacrifice of the strong for the weak, where the survival of the family was more important than personal comfort. If a random traveler stayed overnight in the house, he was also put to bed with everyone else in the common bed without question. Refusal of such an offer on grounds of propriety would have been considered extremely strange, unreasonable, and even offensive to the hosts. In the harsh conditions of the frontier, the sacred laws of hospitality were closely and inextricably intertwined with the pragmatic laws of survival. A guest was an additional source of warmth, not a burden. Sharing a bed was not a matter of intimacy, but a necessity for survival in the cold. The bed itself was often just a simple, rough wooden frame made of beams with thick ropes or leather straps woven through it, instead of the modern slats or springs. These ropes would periodically sag and stretch under the weight of the bodies and had to be regularly tightened with a special wooden bed key. This is where the English expression sleep tight comes from. Literally sleep tight, referring to the tightly stretched ropes of the bed, not just a sound sleep. It was a true empirical science of survival, honed by experience. People intuitively understood from practice that a dense group of bodies retains the heat generated much more efficiently due to a smaller surface area than a single isolated body with a large area of heat loss. The physics of this heat exchange phenomenon was the practical basis for their nighttime survival, even though they did not know the formulas. Experience was more important than theory. Thermodynamics worked independently of an understanding of its laws. Of course, objectively speaking, This method of sleeping together had its serious drawbacks, such as poor hygiene and a complete lack of privacy for couples. But the choice was between life and survival until spring, and the choice was always made rationally in favor of warmth and safety, rather than comfort or decency. The dead don't need decency, and warmth is more important to the living. Survival dictated the norms, not morality or shame. This proven strategy of group sleeping allowed them to successfully survive deadly nights when the air temperature in the unheated hut dropped below 0 degrees, freezing the water. Under a shared multi-layered blanket, a protective cocoon of relative warmth with a positive temperature was created, which was the only real salvation from freezing. The big bed was not furniture for comfort at all, but a collective lifeboat in the midst of a merciless, icy flood of cold that engulfed everything around it. What I am about to show you was the basis of sleep on the frontier, but today it would be considered rubbish. The basis of any bed was a mattress, but it had little in common with its modern counterparts. It was simply a large bag of coarse fabric known as a mattress tick. This bag was stuffed with any available material that could provide at least some insulation from the cold bed base. The most common filler was ordinary straw or hay. It was a cheap and readily available material. Straw had good thermal insulation properties, creating an air gap. However, sleeping on such a mattress was not very comfortable. The straw quickly clumped together, becoming stiff and lumpy. Dry corn leaves and husks were also used as filling. They were softer than straw, but rustled loudly with every movement. Sleeping on such a mattress was accompanied by constant rustling. A more comfortable but rarer filler was cattail down or horsehair. Such mattresses were much softer and warmer, but not everyone could afford them. Regardless of the filling, the mattress required constant care. It had to be shaken regularly so that the filling did not clump together. This was a daily morning routine. Periodically, the filling had to be completely replaced. The old material became damp and began to rot. Therefore, every autumn, families harvested fresh straw or leaves for their beds. This thick layer of organic material served as the main protection against the cold coming from below through the drafty bed base. Its thermal insulation properties were more important than softness and comfort. The main task was to prevent the body from coming into contact with the cold boards. For those who did not even have a simple bed frame, such a mattress was placed directly on the earthen or plank floor. In this case, its thickness and the quality of the filling were crucial. It was the last barrier between the sleeping person and the frozen ground. Sleeping on such a bed required getting used to. It was not rest in the modern sense, but only a necessary respite. But without this simple bag of straw, survival would have been impossible. How well do you think one could sleep on such a bed? In the next chapter, you will learn what served as a blanket when there was no blanket. When it comes to blankets on the frontier, the first thing that comes to mind is heavy hides. Indeed, bison, bear, or deer hides were one of the most valuable and effective means of protection against the cold. One large bison hide could replace several ordinary blankets. These skins were rarely professionally tanned. Most often, they were simply cleaned and dried. As a result, they were stiff and heavy, but unmatched in their thermal insulation properties. The fur created a thick air layer that perfectly retained body heat. Covered with such a skin, one could not fear even the most severe frosts. It is not surprising that they were an important commodity and were highly valued. However, skins were not available to everyone everywhere. A much more common type of bed covering was a quilt or patchwork blanket. But these were not the elegant items we see in museums. Frontier quilts were utilitarian and made out of necessity. They were sewn from any available scraps of fabric, old clothes, flour sacks, leftover curtains. Everything was used. These blankets were not so much beautiful as they were functional. Their main value was their multi-layered construction. Insulation was laid between 2 layers of patchwork fabric, usually wool, cotton, or even just old rags. The entire structure was stitched together with numerous stitches. This prevented the insulation from clumping and made the quilt durable. Such a product served for decades, passing from generation to generation. Patchwork quilts were very heavy, but also very warm. At night, everything in the house was laid on the bed. Layer upon layer created a multi-layered protection capable of withstanding the night cold. The process of making quilts was often a collective one. Women would gather together for so-called quilting bees to help each other sew a new quilt. It was not only work, but also an important social event. Thus, a settler's bed was like a layer cake. At the bottom was a straw mattress, and on top were several heavy patchwork quilts, and if you were lucky, 1 or 2 animal skins. Only such a multi-layered system could ensure survival. Want to learn the ancient secret of survival that allowed settlers to avoid freezing to death before morning? To safely survive a long, frosty night alive, it was categorically insufficient to simply mechanically lie down in a cold bed and cover yourself with a blanket. There was a whole complex series of mandatory rituals and clever tricks aimed at maximizing the conservation and active generation of additional heat for the body. Preparing for sleep was not relaxation, but work to ensure survival until dawn. One of the most common and effective methods of additional heating was to preheat the icy bed with hot water bottles before going to sleep. To do this, smooth stones or bricks were specially heated to a high temperature in a hot stove for hours. They were then carefully wrapped in several layers of thick fabric or an old blanket for protection and placed at the foot of the bed under the blanket to warm it up. The stone was a free battery that stored the heat from the hearth. This simple improvised natural heater slowly released the accumulated heat into the surrounding space for several precious hours of the night. It was crucial in helping to warm up quickly at the most critical cold moment of falling asleep, when the body had not yet generated heat. The main thing was to be careful not to burn yourself on a stone that was too hot and not to burn holes in valuable bedding with an accidental spark. The balance between warmth and safety was delicate. A stone that was too hot was dangerous, and one that was too cold was useless. There were also special handmade devices for the wealthy. Metal hot water bottles on a long wooden handle with a lid. Hot coals from the hearth were carefully poured into such a perforated hot water bottle through an opening. Then it was methodically moved back and forth between the cold sheets to evenly warm the entire bed before going to sleep. This was a more effective but also more expensive alternative to stones, which was not available to all families. Before going to bed, the fire in the hearth was never completely extinguished with water, but was buried or banked for preservation. It was carefully covered with a thick insulating layer of ash on all sides, leaving minimal air access. This allowed the hot coals to smolder slowly until morning without a flame, preserving a little residual heat in the house and making it possible to quickly light a full fire at dawn without difficulty. The preserved fire saved precious time and energy in the morning when every minute counts. An essential part of everyone's nighttime outfit was a warm cap on their head. According to the laws of physics, a significant amount of heat, up to a third of the human body's heat, is lost through the uncovered head with its rich blood supply, and a thick nightcap effectively helped prevent these critical losses to the atmosphere. It was worn everywhere by men of all ages and women without exception. It was a universal necessity, not a matter of fashion or tradition. The whole family consciously tried to go to bed at the same time on command. This allowed them to immediately create a common warm mass of sleeping bodies under shared blankets due to their combined heat. No one went to bed first in a cold, unheated bed. It would have been painful and dangerous. Collective sleep was not just a tradition, but a thermodynamic necessity. Which of these methods do you think are the most effective and practical to replicate today? In the next fascinating chapter, we will take a detailed look at how the piercing cold affected every minute of people's nightlife and sleep. The nighttime cold brought not only discomfort, but also very real dangers. One of the main dangers was the threat of fire. Smoldering coals in the hearth or a spark that landed on a wooden wall could destroy a house in an instant. Carbon monoxide was also a danger. In an attempt to keep warm, people plugged all the cracks, disrupting ventilation. A poorly functioning chimney combined with smoldering coals could lead to poisoning during sleep. The water in the hut froze. A bucket of drinking water left outside the door overnight would be covered with a thick crust of ice by morning. Sometimes the ice had to be melted to make breakfast. Food stored in the house also froze through. Potatoes, apples, and other vegetables and fruits turned to stone. They had to be warmed up by the fire for a long time before they could be used. Constant exposure to the cold was extremely stressful for the body. Even if a person managed not to freeze to death, the cold drained their strength. This led to a weakened immune system and increased the risk of various diseases. The process of waking up at night became a real ordeal. Getting out from under warm blankets into an icy room required tremendous willpower. Any need to get up at night was fraught with the risk of hypothermia. Even his breath was visible. The vapor from the sleeping people's breath settled as frost on the walls and ceiling. In the morning, the hut was covered with a thin layer of ice patterns on the inside. These nighttime dangers were invisible, but always present. They required constant vigilance and foresight from the settlers. Winter nights did not forgive mistakes or carelessness. Each night was a test of endurance, not only for the body, but also for the spirit. It taught one to appreciate the simplest things: warmth, safety, and the light of a new day. Surviving the night was a small daily victory. The morning in the hut began not with an alarm clock, but with the realization of the piercing cold. The first to wake up had the most unenviable task. He had to get out of bed and revive the fire in the hearth. This procedure required skill. It was necessary to carefully rake the ashes, find the smoldering coals, and fan them into life. To do this, they used dry kindling, which was always prepared the night before and stored in a dry place. While the fire was burning, the room remained freezing cold. The rest of the family preferred to stay under the blankets as long as possible. They got dressed right in bed so as not to come into contact with the frosty air. The next task was to fetch water. If the bucket in the house was frozen, they had to go to the nearest spring or well. There, they had to break through the ice to get water for their morning needs. The entire morning routine was devoted to one goal: to warm up as quickly as possible. The main event was a hot breakfast. Hot porridge or soup warmed them from the inside and gave them energy for the day ahead. It took at least an hour before the temperature in the hut rose to an acceptable level. And even then, the warmth was concentrated only around the hearth. In the far corners of the room, the frost lingered until noon. The morning light coming through the frosty window was dim and cold. It did not promise warmth. It only illuminated the scene of the daily struggle for survival. Despite the harshness, this morning was filled with its own rituals. The crackling of burning wood, the smell of smoke and food being prepared. These sounds and smells meant that another dangerous night was behind them. Waking up was not a smooth transition from sleep to wakefulness, but a sharp jolt. It was a moment of mobilizing all one's strength. After all, a new day of battling the cold and other challenges of the frontier lay ahead. In addition to organizing their sleep, the settlers used many other techniques to insulate their homes. One of the most effective was the creation of a snow wall. The outside walls of the hut were covered with earth, turf, or snow around the entire perimeter. This extra layer of insulation closed the lower gaps and protected against the wind. In winter, snowdrifts piled up against the wall served the same purpose. The house seemed to grow into the snow, which made it much warmer. Door and window openings were covered with heavy blankets or skins. This simple measure significantly reduced drafts. Such an improvised curtain was more effective than any poorly fitted door. Inside the single room, partitions were sometimes made of fabric or skins. They created small, more comfortable spaces. A sleeping area separated in this way would warm up faster. The location of the hut itself also played a huge role. Experienced settlers built their homes in natural shelters. For example, under the protection of a dense forest or on the southern slope of a hill, protected from the north winds. The design of the chimney was constantly being improved. It was coated with a thick layer of clay to prevent fire and heat loss. A properly built hearth was a source of pride for the owner. All these tricks were the result of experience and observation. They were passed down from neighbor to neighbor. It was a collective wisdom of survival, accumulated over many generations. We see that every winter night on the frontier was a real battle, in which wit, experience, and unity served as weapons. The cozy image of a log cabin hides a history of daily heroism. Survival was a full-time job, and night was the most difficult and dangerous shift. These people turned their homes into complex heat retention systems where every detail mattered. Sleeping together, layered blankets, hot stones, and ashes-covered coals were all part of one big strategy. They proved that human will and ingenuity can withstand the harshest conditions. What other aspects of life on the American frontier would you like to see in our future videos? Perhaps you are interested in house construction, dietary habits, or farming methods in the wild. Suggest your topics in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the past.